runs on that surface, and you don't need much. Now you've got to make sure that the tab on this picks up the top of that spring, like that. That was held in with 2 shoulder screws. Nip those up, check that moves smoothly, returns correctly, that all looks good. So that part's looking pretty tidy now. What I want to do next here is glue back this leatherette that's come loose on the side piece, and glue back our 2 leatherette patches here and here. I'll remove that so it's not obstructing me. And find those leatherette patches. One of them looks particularly cruddy, so it must have, looking at the state of that, I'd say it's fallen off and been glued back with something inappropriate at some stage. This might not be much better. Yeah, that looks like some water-based adhesive. There's quite a bit of glue on this. It may have been glued back more than once. You'll note that unless you're removing this chrome trim, which is strictly optional, there wasn't much under there to deal with. Unless you're removing that chrome trim, there's no need to remove these leatherette patches. They can stay exactly where they are. So all this crap up here is just dried adhesive, and that's just a small bird whacking off the window. And this adhesive is crumbling on the back of this leatherette. I'm just chipping at it with the edge of my scalpel, and I want that adhesive off there because obviously it hasn't got much grip on the leatherette at all. And so if I just put adhesive on top of it, we just end up with them falling off. I'm amazed at the thickness of adhesive here. Somebody must have either put on an awful lot of whatever it was. Who knows what it was, wallpaper paste, something completely unsuitable. Somebody must have put lots on, or they put it on multiple times after they put it on and the leatherette fell off, and they just put more on. Okay, there's a few fibres of leatherette came off then, so I'm just about down to the leatherette itself. They're very small, these leatherettes, very thin as you can see, so if you get enthusiastic when you're scraping at them with the scalpel like this, next thing you know your leatherette's in 2 pieces or more. That'll do. That's piece number 1. That's clean and ready to go. Piece number 2, I'll pick that up. Let's give this the same treatment. Now the adhesive, as I've said, is brittle, it's thick, and it cracks away from the leatherette quite readily. I'm just sort of chopping at it with the very tip of my scalpel blade, and it's just fracturing and flying off. That looks good. Let's tuck those two chips of leatherette ready to go back on now. Okay, so I want some adhesive next. Let's take those two pieces and wipe them with a bit of naphtha to remove any dust, and there's plenty of dust, or any grease, and there doesn't appear to be much of that, from those leatherette patches, so that when I put the glue on them it'll stick nicely. I can wipe these two front surfaces here on that chrome trim to achieve the same thing. To remove anything that's loose and make sure it's free of grease. Now this piece of leatherette up the side here, I need to clean out underneath that with a bit of solvent. So I'm going to take a cotton bud, peel off a bit of cotton, wrap that around the tip of my tweezers, like that, to make a very small cotton bud. Put some naphtha on that, and I can run that up underneath that leatherette. Make sure both faces there were clean and free from grease. And now some adhesive. Well, we've only got small bits to deal with, so I'll put some adhesive on my paper. Take a toothpick and run some up underneath this loose leatherette here. Now, making sure I've got good cover on the leatherette. I'm not trying to put it on the metal side, just the leatherette side. And press that into place. It's springing away a little bit because it's quite stiff, but it should stick down if I hold it there a second. Now our pieces of leatherette patch from the front here, let's get those in place. Same deal. Get some adhesive on the toothpick. Rub that on the leatherette. Make sure I've got even cover right to the ends. I don't want this going on the front face of the leatherette if I can help it. And I don't want too much on there, I don't want it squeezing out. Let's try that one. I might be a bit generous with that. That sits in here. That looks fine. I'll come and clean up that squeeze out shortly. Do the same for the other side. That looks pretty good. So, a cotton bud, a little drop of naphtha on it, and let's run that round that edge, lift off that excess adhesive. Try not to stick my hand into that one while I'm doing it. Same on this piece. That looks good. Just check that this is all good on this piece on the side. We've got no adhesive sitting places we don't want it. That looks good. Okay, well that piece is all clean and ready to go really. We'll just pop this focus mount back together temporarily. When I'm ready to put the shutter on there, I can put my helical grease on there and get the thread started. There we go. That's the front part there, that's all complete. That would be cocked. That would be released by the capping plate coming up. It's our shutter release there. Everything looking good. I'm pleased with that part. And the body of course is all clean and that just needs to be reassembled. So I've got to start on the reassembly process now that I've got all my components back from the ultrasonic cleaner. So I think I have to clear the decks ready for reassembly. Time for a bit of reassembly I think. Now I usually start by putting in the release and lock levers, and I'm just using some molybdenum paste here. Molybdenum paste is very good lubricant. You need very little of it. And be extremely sparing using it. That's why I normally just wipe it on with a toothpick. You don't need to do much more than leave a dirty mark. I'll just get that clip in place. I can pick it up. Can you see any of that? Yeah, just about. Make sure that's sprung loaded, make sure it moves freely. Here is the release lever. The release lever's job is to, among other things, it ensures that when you press the shutter release that it also releases the film advance to allow you to wind on to the next shot. That spring was a little bit misshapen. I'm not entirely sure it's going to be great, but we'll have a look. Seems okay. The return spring on the top. Yeah, that contrast is too high. I'll pull that curtain across. The sun's coming in the window there. That made probably not much difference at all, even though we're out of the sun. I'll get the return spring on the top of the release lever. I'm supporting that with my finger from underneath at the moment. And see if I can get this screw started. The release lever is split at the top and threaded. That's probably a good place to start. Now, the film advance shaft. You want the shaft and the bush and the take-up spool. Well, the take-up spool and the bush go together. The bush just goes into the round hole in the take-up spool. Put that in the back of the camera. And here's the advance shaft. Now I'm going to lubricate this with a bit of graphite grease. because I like the way this stuff works. You could use something else. I used to use the synthetic grease to do this job. Now here's something interesting. You may see here on this shaft, that's nickel plated, all that shaft. You may see a stripe here, a brass stripe. That's where the last coil of the spring has wound into that metal, just from probably being over tensioned. And it's actually bitten right into the brass at that point. And you can see the brass through the nickel plating. Get that spring seated in its groove. There's a groove in this collar here that spring couples into, and I'm just making sure I've got graphite grease on the shaft itself where it runs through that bush. Rotate that bush once or twice to make sure that grease is indeed running where it should. Where's the stick I wanted? Just put that in the wrong place. Run some on the spring. That's so that the coils of the spring roll smoothly over each other when it's been tightened up to provide the return tension for your film advance lever. Now normally I lubricate the cam on the end of the film advance shaft with some synthetic grease. There's two ratchets, if you like, on here. One that controls forward motion of the film advance lever, one that controls return action. I can drop this down into the body through the take-up spool and through that bush in the bottom of the take-up spool. Now getting this correctly positioned. Now normally with a Retina you would start this in pretty much the neutral position. Here's the notch where the lock lever would fit, and normally that's about the position you would start this off, and then you would shift, and then you'd wind a full wind of tension on it before you'd coupled everything up. With the Reflex, is an extra third of an advance or pre-tensioning helps. So I'm just going to move that round to there, get that lever out of the way, and that should give me a very good tension on the film advance, so that when you reach the end of the stroke, the film advance lever will return to the park position smoothly. The reason you need that is that there's just more action happening in the train that cocks the shutter, and the extra friction involved in all those extra actions mean that a little bit of extra tension to return the lever to the park position is very good. So I'm getting these three screws in position. One of them instantly fell over when I dropped it down the hole. It's sitting on its side. I've got to get lined up. That's better. That's all good. The three screws are all in there. I'll tighten them up. These three screws are not uncommonly loose on Retinas. In this case they weren't, they were fine. Okay, so that looks good. If I rotate this round to the rest position where the lock lever drops in, that's around about here. So the lock lever's dropped in. We've got about a third of a turn of tension on there already. It'll get a whole full turn before I'm finished. And I just need to change the battery in this video camera. Okay, let's just check those screws again. Make sure I didn't leave them loose. No, I've done that right. It's okay. The clutch assembly can go in next. Now the clutch assembly is 3 pieces, and again I typically lubricate this with the graphite grease. This graphite grease is quite sticky. It stays stuck to the surfaces it's applied to. It's very good in a case like this because it means that it's not being pushed away, it's not being cleared away by the sharp edges of this spring. Right, well I'll find the right pliers for this job. I need some pliers that'll help me compress that spring. Now I'll just assemble this clutch. There's a little tag on that spring that drops into a notch in the centerpiece there, and if I get my crimp plug pliers over that, and I'm not squeezing these hard, I'm rotating this to pull that spring into line, and then I can slide the outside of the clutch over it. The clutch always moves smoother in one direction than the other, and by design it moves smoother in the direction it's supposed to move, so that's all good. I'll put some synthetic grease through the centre of that, drop that into place on the top of the take-up spool, rotate it till it drops into the slots in the take-up spool, and then I can deal with the bush for the top of the film advance shaft. Now the gear here, this two little pinions linked together, they're quite dry at the moment because all this has been through the ultrasonic cleaner. So I just forced a bit of grease into that set, drop that into place, give that a wriggle. That's all seated correctly, and this is held in place with a couple of screws. One of them I can see and the other one I can't, so we'll find the right screw for the one I can't, and we'll start with that. And the other one is where the ratchet goes, and this little space that goes in first. One side has got a very slight countersink in the centre, that should be downwards. The plain side should be up. Get that little ratchet pawl in place. Normally I lubricate this with just a touch of synthetic grease. Needs very little. Get that screw through the pawl, through the bush, through the bracket, and screwed into the top housing. I'm not doing those screws up very tight at the moment because I may need to move this. That looks good. And I'll put the gear on the top of this, the parts on the top here. What am I looking for? I was looking for that. The tripod surround, back cover catch surround, that works really well to support this film advance while you're busy putting components on the top. So first of all, we've got the spring that goes on that little ratchet pull. So I'll get that in position. There's a groove around the head of that screw that spring must sit into. Let's check that there's tension on there, and that appears good. The gear that runs on there, normally I run a bit of synthetic grease under that. Drop that into place, rotate it counterclockwise, it'll push the pawl out of the way, and there it is, all seated and ready to go. there's a leaf spring here. Now that's vaguely cup shaped. It should be, the edges should be pointing up, not down. This piece goes on the top. The drive dog goes on here. Here's a washer. And the gear that couples to the cocking rack goes on there. Make sure that's seated correctly. And there's a screw here that goes in the middle. And now I've got to find the screwdriver for that because I've buried it under something. Where have I put it? I think it's behind the curtain. Yes, it was. Hear that tui out there again. Right, well that shaft stopped from turning by the lock lever, so I can tighten that screw up easily. That part's done. Let's flip it over. Now the lock lever for the rewind button needs to go in next. I'll just pop this up on a block, hopefully it'll stay in focus. That sits in here. Here's our lever. Typically I lubricate the tip of that with some molybdenum paste. But if you didn't have any, you could use grease instead. It has a return spring and a screw that holds it all together. It's a shoulder screw. Be careful that the screw goes through the spring. Let's get that seated. So the spring needs to be able to revolve freely around the screw. And the lever needs to be able to revolve freely around the screw. You must wriggle it about a bit to get that screw to pass through the lever. This one's not playing. There we go. That's better. Tighten that up. Check that the lever moves freely. It does. So pick up the end of the spring and get it across behind that lever. Like that. That lever is now sprung loaded. And the sprocket shaft can go in. First off, take our sprocket, the slot goes up, slide that into position in the body at the back. Take our sprocket shaft, bit of synthetic grease to the shaft, towards the top, towards the bottom where it passes through the body. Normally I just put a wipe on the teeth of the pinion on the top, and this should just slide into place. Sometimes it doesn't want to go past the teeth on the pinion here. So loosen those two screws up. Right, there you go, it's dropping into position. Hold that up with my fingers and below. Pull that lever back, that allows it to come right up into position. If I rotate this now, that'll bring the screw hole in line up here. and then there's a small screw that couples that. See if I can get that in position.